Welcome to The Business. I'm Lanre Akinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. This week on The Business, South African Airways requests another government bailout as it struggles to meet repayments on existing debts. Zimbabwe is considering issuing a $3.5 billion government bond after elections scheduled to be held in July. It says the money will be used to clear arrears to foreign lenders. Ethiopia's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, has ruled out opening up the country's telecoms and banking sectors, much to the frustration of business. Nigeria's Dangote cement is looking to list on the London Stock Exchange within 2 years. If it happens, it could be one of Africa's biggest IPOs ever. And in this week's breakdown, we look at the anti-corruption struggle. As French billionaire Vincent Bolloré faces charges for corruption in Togo and Guinea, what is the state of anti-graft efforts on the continent? Joining me throughout for commentary and insight is broadcaster and Africa watcher Vuyiswa Ngobongwana. And in part two, I'll be talking to Malte Lieverscheid, Vice President at Teneo Intelligence, a risk analyst specializing in sub-Saharan Africa. South African Airways CEO Vuyana Urana has said the airline needs money now and is struggling to meet repayments on existing debt. If the airline gets more money from the government, it will be the latest in a long series of government bailouts to try and keep the struggling carrier afloat. Vuyiswa, you're from South Africa. National airlines, sovereign airlines are often seen as a sign of prestige and national pride.
Yes.
But when you can't afford them, they can very quickly become a liability. South Africa has pumped hundreds of millions to try and keep South African Airways going.
Yes.
It's not working. Why do they keep trying?
Well, they keep trying, like you said, for prestige, and it's politically a hot potato because we've got elections coming up and a big run-up to that. So a failure of the running of the national airlines would be absolutely disastrous. But the key thing, from my point of view as a South African, is there could be a lot more digging into how we got to where we are.
And also, South Africa has a long list of economic priorities that it needs to address. The sovereign airline isn't necessarily at the top of that.
You would think so, but then again, you have the benefit of having the overview that comes from being distant from the problem. And I think with the joined-up thinking that comes with the sharing we're having, not only on TV, but in the internet, there are a lot of questions being asked about how South Africa can best utilize its money. And what I find exciting is that the media is being utilized as a mechanism to build a bridge so that the public can have a voice.
We'll have to see if South African Airways can stay up in the air. Zimbabwe is considering issuing a $3.5 billion sovereign bond, it says, to pay off international lenders. The issue could happen after elections scheduled for July. This is, of course, part of President Emmerson Mnangagwa's efforts to change Zimbabwe's image, re-engage with the international community after Robert Mugabe was removed from office late last year. But is borrowing what Zimbabwe should be doing right now. The economy is already struggling. It's very cash-strapped.
Yeah.
One understands the need for some money, but what's the end game here? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, it's the difficulty of every African president trying to get a little foot in the door of the capitalist network that is pretty much already locked in tight over hundreds of years. So Mnangagwa has also got the double problem of offsetting the reputation of Zimbabwe that was created by Mugabe, who challenged the very basis of the capitalist system and tried to go a different route but got no support because the bigger picture is controlled by these players that we're discussing within this. So I don't think he actually has many options other than to do this, and then all he's going to do is take Zimbabwe back to point zero, where they, quote unquote, literally do not owe any money. But some would even question, why aren't we questioning what the debt really is? Because Africa is financing the world effectively at the moment.
It looks like the post-Mugabe era will be easier said than done. Ethiopia's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, has ruled out opening key sectors of the economy, despite frustration from local and international business. Abiy took over as Prime Minister from his predecessor, Haile Mariam Desalegn, who resigned in February amid growing popular pressure for reform in the country. Ethiopia has been one of Africa's fastest growing economy for much of the last 10, 15 years or so. But two issues continue to hover over this story, which is that the telecom sector and banking sector, for some reason, remain closed off.
Well, it might actually be good for Ethiopia in the long run in terms of her actually deciding to take control of some aspect, a major profitable aspect of her own economy. But, you know, it's a bittersweet thing for the ordinary Ethiopian, because the price of having a government like that is effectively a very smooth, seemingly benign form of dictatorship.
Well, what they say is that we're emulating China here, we're emulating Korea here, where, you know, you had strategic opening of the economy in line with national priorities. Yeah. There is some sense to that. I mean, you know, liberalizing completely hasn't worked out that well for many African countries.
No, and it's just taking those small baby steps, but simultaneously, is he bringing Ethiopian people along with him? In fact, do they even know the consequences financially and in terms of job creation of these kind of moves? Those are the nitty-gritty discussions that are missing in all these big economic headlines, which are specifically designed to be mysterious, so we don't know what the hell they're talking about.
It looks like economic opening will be slowly but surely for Ethiopia. Our big story this week, we look at Nigeria's Dangote Cement's plans to list on the London Stock Exchange within the next 2 years. If it happens, it could be one of Africa's biggest IPOs yet and marks the latest stage in the evolution of the Dangote company from a local Nigerian business into a Pan-African player with ambitions to become an international company. Because, you know, there's a lot of jargon around this, IPO, stock markets, this and that. The core of this story is that you have a local Nigerian company that has not only, you know, grown to become quite a big player in its home market, it's expanded all over Africa, and now it's looking to list its shares on the London Stock Exchange, which basically means they can tap into even more money, right? And they can access this sort of international sphere, which very few African companies are able to do. So it's kind of an interesting trajectory here and a nice precedent for the continent.
And look how long it has taken. How many hundreds of years has it taken for an African company that follows the rules, so to speak, joined the capitalist mechanism and has succeeded very well? And so now it'll be interesting to see how tightly closed those doors are as they make their first initial public offering, what you're calling the IPO. But many Africans are actually arguing, well, hold on a minute, we're just coming in at the back door towards the end of a system that's dying on its feet. Why are you following this model, you know, Dangote Cement? Why not do something else with those billions?
The argument would probably be that, well, big companies create lots of jobs.
It'll be interesting for us who like to have an overview of what's going on to see how easy it is for them to actually get into the round the table with the big players, because effectively that's what he's trying to do.
Well, it's not the first time they said they're going to list. We'll have to wait and see what happens. For this week's breakdown, we look at French billionaire Vincent Bolloré, who has been detained in France and is facing corruption allegations in Togo and Guinea relating to events back in 2009 and 2010. The claim is that his company supported presidential campaigns in exchange for highly lucrative contracts. Well, this story has made international headlines. It ticks all the boxes as far as sensationalism goes. You've got billionaires, corruption in Africa, African politicians. But there's something more interesting here, which is that people like Vincent Bolloré historically have been completely untouchable when it comes to corruption in Africa. We know that big multinationals are engaged in corruption, but it's virtually unheard of that someone at that level would be detained and investigated. Surely that has to be a good precedent.
It's a very exciting time in terms of actually seeing the unraveling of a system that really, even if you look at it logically in a scientific manner, is actually degenerating within itself. So this is, to me, just one symptom, and he's just one. He's a perfect mirror of all of them.
We all know corruption is a problem in Africa. The estimate is that it costs something like $50 billion a year to the continent. But very importantly, there are big international players critical in facilitating some of this corruption out of Africa. And they have historically been it's beyond the reach of the law. So it's quite interesting and potentially quite important that now you have authorities properly investigating this. Shell and Eni, two major oil companies, are currently preparing for trial, corruption trial in Italy.
These are really, really exciting times. We're talking about transparency, and before we would talk about it as a theoretical construct, but now we've actually got concrete issues to deal with, of unemployment, of immigration, that are actually forcing the conversation so that we can look at this. I don't think this guy is being investigated because something amazingly wonderful is happening among that sector of people. It's because he's been forced to, and this is, I suppose, the sacrificial lamb who will be watched very closely to see how he is dealt with, and then the others will watch to see what other mechanisms they can have to protect themselves. But we get the picture more clearly than ever. It's great news.
I hope you're wrong, Vuyiswa, but we'll have to wait and see. So corruption is not easy to tackle, but perhaps it is possible. We'll take a quick break now. Join me in part 2 when I'll be talking to Malte Lieverscheid, Vice President at Teneo Intelligence, a risk analyst specializing in sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome back to The Business, the show where we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. I'm Nanrek Kinol, and I'm pleased to have with me Malte Lieverscheid, Vice President at Teneo Intelligence, a risk analyst specializing in sub-Saharan Africa. Malte, thank you very much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, business is all about confidence. Confidence is key. Business loves certainty and predictability. In West Africa, in the Sahel region, that is roughly, sort of south of Algeria, north of Nigeria, if you want to put it that way, we have in recent months and years seen a bit of an escalation in terms of militancy and general instability in the region. There's talk of groups linked to ISIS, groups linked to Al Qaeda, sort of proliferating across the region, and it all sounds very scary. How big of a problem is this?
We have seen this rise, and I can give you the numbers as well. So from 2016 to 2017, the number of incidents associated with Al Qaeda linked groups in Mali and Burkina has almost doubled. And even now in 2018, we have already counted some 80 or so incidents.
And it was a very high profile attack just a couple of months ago as well.
Exactly, so it's spreading downwards, it's spreading south to Ouagadougou, that's the attack you just mentioned. We also see the attacks taking a different shape. So previously, there was much more focus on soft targets on behalf of those militants, and now we've seen the switch. They're really going for the hard targets. The one in Ouagadougou, they went after the French embassy and the army headquarters. So this is as hard security as it gets in Burkina Faso.
Now, who are these groups? Now, there's all sorts of speculation. We know that there are groups. There's a group called Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which I believe traces to Algeria. There's talk that Al-Shabaab, has links to the region. There's talk of Boko Haram having links to various groups. Like, are there any numbers on this? Is there any sort of real information on where these groups are, how they operate, how they're funded? How are they able to get away with this?
Indeed, information is rather scarce in this part of the world. But what we do now is there has been a merger of Al-Qaeda-linked Islamist groups basically operating from Mali that took place in March last year. And ever since, we have seen this dramatic rise in incidents, not only in Mali, which still is the epicenter of this conflict, but as I said, it's spreading out. It's spreading into Burkina, northern Burkina, southern Niger. And
this is pretty difficult territory because, people might be watching this thinking, well, why can't the police just go out and get them, or the military? I mean, we're talking about, thousands of square kilometers of basically desert and and terrain that is almost impossible to cover or traverse. So you're looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack, which raises the question of what do you do about it? Now, there's a very high-profile initiative being championed by Emmanuel Macron called the G5 Sahel Security Force, the first major international effort to actually set up some sort of military response or some sort of security response to this. It's pretty new. You give us a bit of a sense of what this is all about and how this might work. Is it going to work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the G5 Sahel force is just the new kid on the block, I would term it, because there actually is quite a lot of international military engagement going on in the region already. So we have the French Operation Barkhane, which operates across the Sahel, 4,000 soldiers, which is the largest French overseas deployment as of today. We also have in Mali MINUSMA, a 10,000 strong United Nations force. And then we have quite a few bilateral missions going on, funded by, again, the French, the EU, the US.
And the US, interestingly, is trying to keep a low profile, but yeah. There were a couple of deaths, a few months ago, which kind of shone the spotlight on that. So, okay, so you've already got quite a few boots on the ground, as they say. What difference is adding a few more thousand going to make? Is this, it sounds like it might be a bit of PR.
It definitely does, yeah. So the approach here is it's twofold. One, this new mission is supposed to address one specific gap in this overall approach that I've just outlined, and that is guarding or patrolling the shared borders in this region, which is something that neither MINUSMA, which is again exclusively focused on Mali, nor the French Barkhane have previously done. So address that kind of gap which needs to be addressed, because as you said, porous borders is a key part of the problem here. And secondly, the second driver behind this is to share the burden and involve the regional governments more, as they are currently do, because for now it's very much driven by the French and by the US, so outside military
That
forces.
was going to be my next question, because we're hearing about French troops, we're hearing about US troops, we're hearing about Saudi Arabia funding the G5 Sahel, etc., etc. I'm not hearing much about Nigerian troops, Malian troops, troops from Niger, etc. What is the regional stance on this? How can African governments come together here a little bit more effectively to do something about it?
Yeah. In fact, we have seen a similar initiative to the G5 Sahel in Nigeria and in the Lake Chad region, where something called the MNJTF, a multinational joint task force made up of Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger, is supposed to counter the menace of Boko Haram in the region. Now, that example is actually, I mean, if we take that as an example and make some inferences as to where the G5 Sahel is headed, then I'm not overly enthusiastic about it, because there has been a lot of talk, a lot of window dressing, but when it comes down to it, the actual difference that it has made on the ground is very, very little. And especially when it comes to joint operations, countries are very hesitant to let other armies operate on their ground. It has made some progress in terms of sharing information, but that is basically all it has produced so far.
That suggests that this isn't as simple as a military response. You can't just send soldiers in there and it'll fix itself. Obviously, there's a security element to this, but there's a bigger picture as well. This is also a region that is key for migration routes through Africa, and there is the issue of things like the drug trade coming out of South America, which has turned West Africa into a bit of a hub going up into Europe. All of this to me sounds like it has the makings of quite a complex socioeconomic problem and not just a security problem.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, actually. What we've seen so far is an approach from the international community that focuses exclusively on the military aspects and trying to solve it militarily. Part of it is, I think, driven by the US. The US focus on basically the absence of an overall Africa strategy driven by the State Department. What we've seen is the Department of Defense sort of filling that void and doing its thing, which basically means militarizing US policy towards the region. So it's actually very difficult to take a step back and redirect the whole thing, come up with a more comprehensive strategy that would address the underlying socioeconomic tensions that actually are fueling this conflict.
Well, part of addressing those tensions is, of course, driving growth, investment, development, and a key part of that is business. So, what's the perspective from business on this? If I'm an investor, if I'm looking at the region, how concerned should I be today? And how concerned might I be in future if this problem isn't tackled? Because you mentioned earlier that it's spreading.
Indeed. Interestingly enough, what we have seen over the past years or so is a huge rise in foreign direct investment, specifically going into mining, gold mining in particular, especially in Burkina, but also in Mali. And that has gone on uninterrupted. And the reason for that is mainly that the escalating security crisis that we see is still sort of confined to areas of the country where there isn't actually mining going on. All the major mining operations that we see in Mali and in the southwest, same in Burkina in the south. And as long as it stands this way, mining operators are actually rather relaxed about the situation.
It sounds a bit like putting your head in the sand. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, well, it's not here, so fine, we'll just continue. That doesn't sound sustainable. I mean, sooner or later, it's going to come to where you are, right?
That's exactly our concern as well. I mean, the reason why we haven't seen major attacks on mining sites is that there has been a dramatic increase in security in those areas. So we have seen the army going in, beefing up security, which is fine for now. But bear in mind that these groups that we're talking about, they have been able to pull this kind of action up, pull it up in Amenas, in Algeria,
and the French embassy in Burkina Faso, as you said, it doesn't get any more secure than that.
Exactly, and then also think about the risk of kidnapping, especially on the transit routes from, be it Bamako or Ouagadougou to those mining sites.
Malte, we're almost out of time. We have just a few seconds left, and if you can, just give us your top 2 or 3 priorities of what needs to happen to address this and make sure that this problem is properly tackled.
I think the first concern would be...
literally 10 or 15 seconds.
All right. I think the key thing here is more coordination between the national partners, first and foremost, but also between the national sphere and regional governments, because they need to be involved much more than they currently are.
Malte Lieberscheid, thank you very much for joining me on The Business today. That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching The Business, and please join us again next time.